So I guess I've only recently been learning more about Victorian realism, and I was surprised that, Hardy, Dickens, and Eliot all fall under the camp of Victorian realism. So do you have any thoughts kind of on how her realism compares with that of Hardy or Dickens?
I I would think I personally think that she is the most realistic, the most recognizable characters. Sometimes with Dickens, they sometimes, I mean, Dickens fans will be furious, but sometimes some of her characters, I feel his characters tend to be a bit stereotyped, a bit two-dimensional. Not all of them. There are some wonderful ones, of course, but George Eliot, you usually get pretty rounded, lifelike characters in whom you can believe. And therefore she carries you along with the story, because these characters seem to be real live people that you've met them or you understand them. Hardy, well, I'm not sure. I prefer to read George Eliot to Hardy, but I do like Hardy, and I like Hardy's poems especially. There's an awful lot of coincidences in Hardy.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that, but there definitely is.
Yeah. I remember teaching the Mayor of Casterbridge, I think, with 16-year-olds, and they were really quite cross that there were so many coincidences that allowed them to progress. I suppose a lot of authors, struggle in the same way of how do you move the story on. But no, I just think that I understand perhaps more of the 19th century Middle England anyway from reading George Eliot.
Mm-hmm. And Vivienne, what do you think?
Last year, I think it was last year, in London, we had a very fine exhibition of Van Gogh's work, and as you entered it, you saw his books, or they had just replicas of the books that he had on his bookshelf, and half of them were George Eliot books. And then when I delved into it a bit more, I read in his letters, and he was writing back to his brother and just saying how much he loved Felix Holt, for example, and how George Eliot paints the ordinary person in the same way that Vincent van Gogh was wanting to portray ordinary people. But the extraordinary thing about Eliot, and it all goes back to her background in Nuneaton, she straddled two camps. She was in the world of the aristocracy up at Arbury Hall. And I think that's really important to remember. It's not all about the local people or ordinary people. She actually gets into the minds of lord and ladies and all sorts of people. And that the sheer range of characters, I think you don't get in Hardy or Dickens. And so, for example, her second novel, not the second novel, Scenes of Clerical Life, the second story, Love Story of Mr. Gilfield, which I've mentioned, Sir Christopher Cheverel is Sir Roger Newdigate. Well, if you have a tour around the wonderful Arbury Hall, you can see that this Gothicisation of this wonderful Elizabethan mansion originally, she's based it all on Sir Roger, because she knew the stories. She used to go up with her father on the little pony and trap, and he would leave her with the housekeeper in the housekeeper's room, and she would hear all the stories, and she just remembered them and put them in, and she's remembered that those, inheritance rights, and one or two novels are quite complicated legally speaking. She did employ a lawyer to help her, particularly with the inheritance in Felix Holt, for example. So she's very aware, and we know that in Arbury Hall. We know it's all based on fiction. And I have to say, when we did have this great highlight of the play, which was in the grounds of Arbury Hall last August, with Sophie as Katerina, Lord and Lady Daventry, who are the present incumbents, and he is related from Sir Roger, or Sir Roger's line anyway, the Newdigate line. Yeah, they were there in the audience, and their children, so
wow.
Thrilling. So we're a bit, it is a bit unusual what we offer, I suppose, in Nuneaton, or what George Eliot experienced growing up in Mary Ann Evans. It was a bit unusual. You've got the ordinary people and the market town and and yet you've got this aristocracy, and you've even got that a little bit in Silas Marner. You've got the the lord of the manor. It's not the same, but he is. Yeah, you've got a bit them and us, I suppose, and bringing together two worlds. But you see, as John said earlier, what's the difference? You know, everyone, we share the same humanity, and that's what George Eliot understood, and that's what Vincent van Gogh valued in her. That in her novels, she had seen into our hearts, and she knew our struggles. And furthermore, I mean, there is a very annoying saying that goes around the internet, and people are always quoting it, saying it's by George Eliot, and it never was. None of us has ever been able to find it. And it's this saying called, "It's never too late to be what you might have been." And it's always attributed to George Eliot on the internet. And Rebecca Mead, a very fine writer, she did write a superb book about this, actually, that she'd researched it. It never happened. The point is that Eliot does not think, really, that it's never too late to be what you might have been. We might like to think that. This is one of these feel-good, buoy yourself up, you know, optimistic, you know, be positive, dream your dreams. You're as, you know, great or as small as your dreams. In some ways, there's that realism that you were talking about earlier, Kate, that actually life isn't like that, that sometimes it is too late for us. It's too late for Bulstrode in Middlemarch, for example. So there's a real, realistic view, isn't there, John, of Eliot's assessment of humanity, but sort of non-judgmental. Bulstrode, the banker, might have been deceptive and had these dark secrets, and he's been living a lie. But the scene where he opens his heart to his wife.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and that's what she's got. She's not being judgmental in any way of humanity, of poor suffering humanity.
No, she's not.
She knows we're just doing the best we can, and her characters are doing the best they can, and they've got flaws, and they're funny, some of them, and some of them are. We haven't even talked about the humour, Kate. Isn't that? Gosh, we can't.
Yeah, you think she has a fair amount of humour in her?
Yeah.
We can talk about it.
Yeah. So in Mill on the Floss, I think this is where my sort of playwriting career started, because it's just the aunts, George Eliot's aunts, and in fact Mary Ann Evans did have these aunts. We believe they're drawn from her own aunts from childhood, and they're just hilarious. And there's one who is stingy, and she will wait till her clothes come around the second time for fashion, and she comes in but her clothes are full of mould and mildew. And another one can hardly get in the doorway, and another one is a hypochondriac. Mrs. Pullet, Aunt Pullet, the hypochondriac, is hilarious. But we all know hypochondriacs, and we all know people who. So and then you've got the quips and the wittiness and the put down. I mean, really, I think in Felix Holt. Perhaps not so much, although I do love Felix, and I just love his ambition to school all these boys, actually, in his mother's kitchen. He's just a terrific character. He's a bit bolshy, and he's determined to be a working class man, and I'm giving up my middle class pretensions and all that. He's quite funny, really, in some ways, but terribly earnest too, and he needs a lot to be knocked out of him, which of course it is. And then you have Daniel Deronda, which I don't think we've mentioned.
No.
Daniel Deronda is Eliot's final novel, and I love that too. And honestly, I mean, Eliot and Lewis always used to go abroad the minute she'd finished the novels. They were plagued by illnesses and headaches and all sorts of things all their lives, and they were always taking the waters here and there. But they would go off abroad after, you know, when she put her pen down, posted off to the publisher Blackwood usually, and she'd go abroad. And that they went abroad. When she came back, not only had Daniel Deronda been so well received, but I think the chief rabbi had written to her and said, thank you for your sympathetic representation of Jewish people and the disappointments and the hopes and the dreams of Jewish people. She had actually been fascinated by Judaism all her life. I mean, we haven't talked about George Eliot and religion. She was brought up in a sort of conservative Church of England sort of home. Her father would have followed his employer's religion, which is Lord and Lady of the Manor, High Church, Tory, conservatives. As Mary Ann grew in her teens, she came under the influence of an evangelical teacher, Miss Maria Lewis, and she became an evangelical. And you get a bit of this in Mill on the Floss. You get Maggie embracing a much purer way of approaching God, almost to the point of fanaticism and denial. And she needs Philip Wakeham to say to her, Maggie, you're just renunciating everything. There's no joy in life if you just live a life of renunciation. So she's always working through the religion of her childhood, the religion of her adolescence. And then actually, as she met free thinkers, she moved to Coventry when she was 21. Coventry is still a city. And she mixed with the free thinkers, the radicals. She met a different sort of people, really, and they were really agog with the ideas of the time, whether it's evolution or women's emancipation or slavery. She was there in the thick of it. And so gradually she threw aside her adolescent faith. And I mean, we often say with George Eliot that it's a faith, it's a religion of humanity she offers us. And by that, I mean, it's seeing the good in people, really, and seeing what there is. She may not believe in the literal tenets of the Christian faith. So there was lots that she loved about her, the religion she was brought up in. But I've strayed off the subject of humour. In Daniel Deronda, I love Gwendolyn Harlott. She's so witty. I mean, just talking to you makes me want to read her again, because really, it's the final book, and she gives us this extraordinary heroine. In fact, everyone said, "Oh, we like Daniel Deronda, but it's in 2 books." And the Cambridge critic F.R. Leavis was really scathing. He said, "Just ditch the Jewish side. Just ditch it. And just focus on Gwendolyn," which I can't go along with that. But I'm just saying, Gwendolyn's quite a character. So if you want a bit of, life and wit, yeah. And Esther Lyon in in Felix Holt is a live wire too, isn't she, John?
Yeah, I'm currently rereading Daniel Deronda, and I forget too, kind of at the beginning, I don't have much sympathy for Gwendolyn.
No.
Yeah, but then as it goes on, you gain much sympathy for her. So if one of you could kind of touch on, we chatted briefly in the email about this, the significance of the year 1859 for George Eliot, kind of what it did for her writing career.
Well, it's the publication of Adam Bede, really, and we're really looking forward to Gail Marshall, who's at Reading University in the UK, is writing a book called 1859, and she is a George Eliot scholar, Victorian scholar, and it will be really interesting to see what she has to say. But for George Eliot herself, Adam Bede was the turning point, really. I think, wouldn't you say, Viv, that, Scenes of Clerical Life was her first attempt, and it got positive reviews, but not huge sales. And then Adam Bede hit the market, really, and there was just no stopping her. It was immensely popular, sold in huge quantities, and it's a distressing story in many ways. Poor old Hetty it's just it's an awful situation to be in. And she did. I think what emerges also in Adam Bede is her sensitivity as a writer, but her humour as well. I mean, we've just been talking about humour, and very often people who have read a bit of George Eliot and may not be particularly confident readers of 19th century literature, which is quite a specialised interest these days, you know, find it difficult to relate to the idea that George Eliot is an amusing writer, that there's a fabulous sense of humour there. But there is, and it's usually coming out through her choice of language, in the way she describes. There's that wonderful sense of irony that goes through so much of her writing. But then you get, you know, Mrs. Poyser in Adam Bede. It's one of the great comic creations of English literature. She's absolutely wonderful. And so many quotations that you can have from her, you know, and they're wonderful. But I think
the ultimate passive aggressive mother.
Yeah. So, you know, suddenly George Eliot was everywhere, and everybody wanted to know who was this George Eliot anyway. I mean, it's a rather complicated story, which it would take forever to go on. Viv and I have been involved with, there's been a suggestion by the organisers of the Women's Prize for Fiction, which was won this week by Maggie O'Farrell with Hamlet, which is a fabulous book. But the organisers they'd realised that in the early 19th century, quite a lot of writers used a male name. And so they wanted to sort of re-establish, reclaim the name. And so they wanted to reprint, well, as ebooks, so not very expensive. They wanted to reprint these 25 books, but they chose one of them as Middlemarch. Now, because by the time Middlemarch was published, she was known all over the world. Everybody knew she was a woman. She just happened to use George Eliot as her pen name. So there were problems way back in 1859 because people wanted to know who George Eliot was. In the Nuneaton area, a man called Joseph Liggins, I don't know whether you know this story, Kate, but a man called Joseph Liggins he'd been to Cambridge University. He was quite bright, but he was thrown out of Cambridge, and he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, really. And he went round the pubs of Nuneaton, sort of claiming to have written Scenes of Clerical Life initially, and then Adam Bede. And he would go into a pub and say, you know, the publishers never paid me for writing Adam Bede. And of course, all the local, haven't they? My God, that. And it was, I mean, it would have amused George Eliot years later if she was writing it as a story. But it involved, you know, clergymen, quite high up clergymen got involved in arguing the case for this Joseph Liggins and how awful it was of the publishers not to pay her. So there was all that going on in the background of the success of the book, and eventually towards the end of 1859, Lewis and George Eliot confessed to the publisher. I think he was invited, wasn't he? He was invited to meet George Eliot, and because he was up in Edinburgh most of the time, and he visited them. And I think George Eliot went out of the room and then came back in, and Lewis, they made a bit of a drama of it, you know. Well, this is George Eliot. Oh, right. I think he might have been a bit suspicious anyway. He was a canny bloke. So literary London was beginning to suspect, you know, that this Miss Evans might be the person. Locally, there were people on the Arbury estate, and even Isaac Evans, her brother, I think, picked up so many references internally, you know, that it would have led him to say, this has got to be my sister. She's the only person who would have known, or, you know. Wow. So there was that to be dealing with. And yet she's got a hugely successful novel, which is making shed loads of money for them, you know. And enables them pretty soon to move to a big house on the edge of Regent's Park and so on. And she becomes part of the establishment of writers. But still at this point, there is the sort of discrimination against her. Even at this point, Lewis will be invited to the opening night of a play or to a concert, or, you know, some art event, and Miss Evans won't be invited.
Mm.
So as Viv was saying earlier about her, the way she recognises isolation in the human condition, she knew all about that, really, of stopping at home whilst her partner is gadding off, and simply because London society disapproved of her living in sin with this man. Also in 1859, Chrissy, her sister, died, didn't she, Viv? It was that same year. As she was sort of writing, she obviously finished Adam Bede and was writing Mill on the Floss. And she was very fond of Chrissy. And so that was a sort of personal tragedy and upset for her. But it must have been marvellous for her, by then sort of nearly 40 or 40 during that year, to suddenly have this huge success. Where everybody, I mean, if it was now, she'd be on every television, all the arts programs, and all the papers would be full of it. It must have been marvellous for her, and to be financially secure, and to know that she could help Lewis's children, and all those sorts of things that money can bring. And they were both pretty astute business people. She was quite canny, and Lewis was too. So it was a sort of turning point in her literary career as well. And it was when she would have decided that she was sticking with the name George Eliot, because the Women's Prize for Fiction wanted to have reprinted, printed a few copies of Middlemarch by Mary Ann Evans. It's an absolutely crazy thing to do, because she would never have called herself Mary Ann Evans. She didn't like, as Viv said earlier, she didn't like the name Mary Ann by the time she was in her 20s. She wanted Marion. And by the time she was writing Middlemarch, she was Marion Evans Lewis. So why not use that if you want? But it distorts the whole idea of the integrity of a writer. A writer decides what he or she is going to be called. It's not for some group 150 years later to say, oh no, you should have called it. So
are they still going through with it?
Yeah, it was the story. They created this. What they were really wanting was media attention.
Okay.
That's the bottom line of it. And because it's the 25th anniversary and it's the Women's Prize for Fiction, somebody in a PR company, that would be a nice idea. But they didn't think it through. And they certainly didn't think it through where George Eliot was concerned, So we've poured scorn on it. And in fact, I think it's proved us right, because what attention has been given to it has all concentrated on aspects of George Eliot that we wouldn't be concerned with. So a journalist produced an article about this sort of sexually voracious woman who was a danger to every woman's husband in London. It's got nothing to do with George Eliot, but it covered a full page of the Mail, which the sort of feminist impulse behind the Women's Prize for Fiction would have been horrified by.
Right.
Blame themselves, because it was their idea that led to this, Anyway, that's not important really. The 1859 is it must have been such a packed year for them. It really must, for both of them. They were established in their life together. They'd been living together since 1854. She was becoming very successful. He was. It must have been marvellous, I think, and I suppose it gave her the confidence to go on to do Mill on the Floss and Silas Marner and all the rest.
So I wonder what both of you think. I feel like the Victorian authors I hear about first are Dickens and the Brontes, even Elizabeth Gaskell. She's a bit more under the radar, but in the online book community that I'm a part of, Gaskell's very well loved. I love Gaskell. Why is it, do you think, that you just hear about George Eliot less?
I have thought about this long and hard. I do think she is wordy, and we've got to remember. I mean, people were saying about her, she was the best educated woman in the 19th century. Everybody was saying that. A critic of the time called her the female Shakespeare. Now, we're talking about an incredibly brilliant woman. She first published, she didn't make her name, because the first thing she published, actually, she didn't even get her name on it because it was a translation. But we're talking about, she knew several languages, and the first thing she published was the Life of Jesus, Strauss's Life of Jesus, in 3 volumes from the German. She went on to Spinoza and all sorts of. She was a very, very clever woman, and sometimes, and I don't mind this, and it sounds like you don't mind it either, Kate, because almost there's a satisfaction, there's a tremendous satisfaction of persevering to get to the end of a sentence that might have started half a page earlier. So there's a sense that she's unfashionable, because these days it's sound bites, isn't it? And it's shorter sentences, and don't use so many semicolons and just pile up your subordinate clauses and so on. It's a bit unfashionable. Whereas I just can, once I'm involved in a story, I can follow it through, and I kind of, maybe I rush, maybe I read too quickly, but I can get the gist of what she's saying, even if it's like a periodic sentence and the meaning is kept to the very end. And that is what I like. And it's, as you say, it repays so much study. But we somehow we can't get across the, and I think it is partly that is really stopping people. There have been some marvellous films and productions. The BBC did a wonderful production of Middlemarch.
Yes.
You can get it in America. And I found this as adapting her plays, her novels for fiction, for plays. Yeah, of course, I cut out a lot, don't I? That's my job. I cut it, even when I did Silas Marner for children. It's my job to edit and cut down. That's fine. I can get the goodness out of her. And actually, that's my passion. What drives me is to popularise George Eliot. So you're talking to me. I'm doing my best, but I haven't really solved this yet. We're hoping that the Visitor Centre will give us a base where we can welcome visitors from all over the world, and we can tell the story, take them to the various settings and the landscapes around the local area, and where they'll be able to see that North Warwickshire is a wonderful place to visit. And of course, you have got a certain gentleman in the south of Warwickshire called Shakespeare. You could pop along to Stratford as well. But we're sort of trying to develop this. But that's my feeling, that she's a bit too brainy for her own good, and she possibly needed a good editor. I don't know what you think about that, John.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, really, because the impetus in all our lives at the moment, certainly where the media are concerned, is towards accessibility. You know, that's the guiding thing. Everything must be accessible to everybody. Well, it's a bit difficult with George Eliot, because actually she makes demands on you, you know, and in a way you get a reward for what you're prepared to put in. And that isn't necessarily always a fashionable view, you know, but it ought to be. We ought to be able to understand all. Well, no, you've got to just settle down and stick at it, and then you'll be rewarded. And they are long, but lots of Victorian novels were. And I mean, in a way, it's easier for Viv and I to say it because we were professional English teachers. It was our job in a way. And people who have got busy lives and Netflix and, you know, all these other interests find it easy or easier to go for the less challenging option, I think.
Yeah, I think also you touched on Netflix. I hear a lot of people, and particularly moms, and I'm a stay-at-home mom, and so people will say, well, I don't have time to read. But you don't hear anyone say, I don't have time for Netflix.
No, that's right. Okay. That's very
so it's, you know, if you don't choose to read, you don't choose to read, but people put on this victimhood of, I don't have time to read. But I think if you just read, you know, 1 or 2 chapters of Daniel Deronda a day, you can read in a little over than a month.
Yeah.
And so I kind of think, you know, maybe a good method would be slowly chipping away. And there is an app you can get called Serial Reader, and it sends you little installments each day.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I haven't actually checked. I know I tried doing Vanity Fair that way, but I haven't checked what George Eliot might be available through Serial Reader. But yeah, I think it's just if you trust that you will get a big reward from it, you're willing to, kind of put in the time.
Right.
I'm curious if there's a sort of certain detail or anecdote from her life that's one of your favorites that you kind of really, it's just a beloved thing about George Eliot to either of you.
Gosh.
No, not sure about that.
Well, you can think on it. We could come back to that later.
I was going to say, Kate, that although we're talking about this complexity, and she is a complex novelist, probably the most complex novelist, but the Fellowship, and certainly Viv and I, aren't precious about it. So that, we love nothing more than doing a George Eliot tour, where there are some readings, but they're quite tiny, short readings. They're manageable readings. Or we'll take a group to Griff House, and we can point up to the attic window and say, look, that's the attic that inspired her to write. And then we read the bit from The Mill on the Floss of Maggie rushing up to the attic, And for a lot of people, particularly local people, that's okay. And maybe that's as much as they need from George Eliot. But at least we've given them that. And they might then have maybe a little bit more respect for the reputation of this woman who they haven't read. There is certainly within the Nuneaton area a feeling by people that, well, this woman is obviously important because people keep talking about her and she's known all over the world, but I can't cope with her. Well, I think I ought to. They feel that they ought to know a bit more about her. And in some ways, those are the sort of people that we hope to attract to the visitor centre, just to find out a bit more, or to come on one of our walks or one of our tours or some readings, They don't have to challenge themselves to read Middlemarch, but we can tell them one or two bits from Middlemarch, which is better than nothing, I think we would say, because that would be our philosophy, I suppose,
Yes.
But in their own life, oh goodness.
Well, I think, and I don't think we've completely got into representing her, the fire that she had in her belly and the strength and the courage that it took to follow her heart and to live with Lewis, even though he was married. And she knew, eyes wide open, she knew that she was going to be ostracized, and even beloved friends couldn't speak to her for about a year. I don't think we've completely conveyed this, and I think this could be part of your earlier question, Kate, about why is she a bit under the radar? How the BBC did do a film called A Scandalous Life, so they did try to get into that, but that's not the angle I would want particularly. What I would want to present is this incredibly strong feminist woman who wasn't allowed to go to university in those days, so she just educated herself, and they said she was the most well-read woman in the whole of England. No one could beat her because she, in her journals, it's just phenomenal. She's always writing down which book she's reading. So she educated herself. She didn't have the advantages that her older brother had, and we see that in Mill on the Floss. Maggie Tulliver's the clever one. She should have gone to uni. Poor old Tom, he struggled so much with his Euclid and all his school lessons. Bless him, but he was so good at the outdoor stuff and the practical stuff. So she's writing about the woman question. She's not fully committed to it. Some of her friends were. Barbara Boddican is part of the movement that founded Girton Women's College in Cambridge. She sent £50, but she could have sent more. She was interested in it, but it was almost like, I'm doing it anyway. I'm doing it anyway. I've proved that you can do just as much as the male writers of the day and more. What is often concerning feminists about Eliot is her endings. What often concerns them are her endings of her novels, that she, does she rather give in? Does she actually again and again and again, the heroines seem to actually opt out. So whereas Dorothy was going to make massive social changes and really improve the life of the poor, in the end she just accepts that she's going to be the wife of a MP and they'll move to London and she'll blah blah blah. And there's this sort of dropping out, even in Adam Bede, Diana Morris, who started off as a Methodist preacher. This is the most amazing opening to a novel.
Yes.
Diana Morris preaching on the Green. Now Eliot's got all her facts right, because the early Methodists did allow women to preach outside, I believe. And then there came a point when they stopped it, and she's actually brought that into a novel. So the ending of Adam Bede, dear old Dinah, she marries and doesn't preach anymore. So it is frustrating sometimes, because a woman like me can read George Eliot and go, or know about George Eliot's life and know that she's achieved everything a man does and more. And yet actually she sort of throws away some of her heroines. But as I say, I think it's just something that I'm only just beginning to get to grips with. How can we convey the way that Eliot was so ahead of her time? How do we convey? Because she really was, again and again and again, she was ahead, and she saw things, and she lived a life that was 21st century, really.
An episode whilst Viv was talking about you asked about one event, maybe. I'm always really, really struck by the way in which Marion, as she would be calling herself then, handled this retreat from established faith, the established church, and the way in which, this awful thing with her father, who, when she decided that she could no longer go to church, she just couldn't cope with the paraphernalia, really, of established religion. And yet she retained that spirituality and interest in religion throughout her life. But the episode for me that is really interesting and revealing about her is the way in which she's obviously, her father is horrified by her decision and can't understand why. Plus the fact that, what's this girl doing, disobeying, my wishes to go to Holy Trinity Church with him every Sunday. And she must have talked to him, I suppose, and felt that she was getting nowhere. What she did eventually, and this, it was Rebecca Mead actually who brought this home to me when I read her book, that what she did, how she coped with it, was what any writer would do. And she wrote a letter, and she wrote this letter to her father, explaining in some detail, really, about why she had made that decision. And she's so contrite, really, and says, if you want me to go and live somewhere else, or I will, but I won't compromise on this. And it's such a revealing letter in that it sort of sets the seal for so much of the rest of her life, that, as Viv indicated, that this was a woman of some determination as well as huge intelligence. But it's a really interesting insight into how she dealt with it by it's a wonderful letter. It's a wonderful letter. We have actually read it to groups in Holy Trinity Church. This is the church in Coventry which survived the bombing of the Second World War. And there is a plaque now on one of the pillars that says George Eliot attended this church. It doesn't say what he did, it says attended. And we've taken groups and sat them in the pews so that they look at this little slate plaque and read the letter that she wrote to her father. And that's quite a moving experience, isn't it, Viv? It's you feel that you're beginning to understand a bit of what was moving this woman and making her tick and making her think of her own future.
Well, I do think you talked about how she was a woman so ahead of her time, and we talked briefly about the portrayal of Jewish people in Daniel Deronda. I think that's a big, she shows them as fully fleshed human beings, not just these, even, it's not just positive stereotypes. They just feel like the other characters in the novel. And I think it's really, really marvelous. What is your favorite biography of George Eliot? Do you have one?
I wouldn't say I had one. I have several. I mean, we all sort of defer to Gordon Haight, really, because...
Is that George Eliot, The Last Victorian?
No, that's Catherine Hughes.
Okay.
Gordon Haight was a great professor, really, wasn't he, Viv?
University.
Yeah. And he edited, he produced well, not the first, but the first major biography, really, in the 60s. But he was getting on by then, but he had spent most of his academic life working on George Eliot, and he edited the 9 volumes of her letters, which are fantastic to dip into. Absolutely amazing. So he is the one. If you ask any of the biographers since the 60s, in the last 50, 60 years, they will all say, well, it all started with Gordon Haight, and all we're doing really is standing on the shoulders of this giant. But of the subsequent ones, Rosemary Ashton is very good indeed.
I'm going to write that down.
And Rosemary Ashton is one of our vice presidents and is lovely and very, very supportive of us, but a very, very shrewd writer.
And I've just read her biography of George Henry Lewis as well.
Ah, yes.
I recommend Rosemary Ashton.
Yeah.
But so the one you mentioned, Kate, was Catherine Hughes, The Last Victorian. Yeah, because Queen Victoria and Mary Ann Evans were born in the same year.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I have not read a biography of her, but I'm planning on, in November, I want to read. I really love Jenny Uglow's biography of Elizabeth Gaskell. So I picked up hers of George Eliot.
George Eliot. Yes. Yeah. I mean, she's a fine writer. Most of them are they're really interesting.
Philip Davis is a
Philip Davis,
wonderful professor at Liverpool University.
Yeah. And it's becoming, or you think it's becoming, difficult to say new things about George Eliot, because there's been a major biography or major work about her pretty well every year for the last 40 years. It's quite extraordinary. And yet, and this is a tribute to her, I suppose, and her intellect and abilities, that they all seem to find something, some other slight angle, And we're interested locally in the Nuneaton area because although Gordon Haight did some work, there were a few gaps, and there were one or two very good local historians, or a professional history teacher, one of them, for instance, who is really delving into some of the Newdigate papers, all very time-consuming and would be too time-consuming for an academic on a busy schedule of trying to write a biography, And so there's a lot of really interesting work being done by local people, which thrills us because it makes the links, it makes the connections. Nancy Henry is in the States, and she's done some wonderful work on George Eliot.
And biographies sort of that people are working on. Brenda Mackay is a great friend to the fellowship, Dr. Brenda Mackay. She's working on a biography. And Professor Beverly Rylett in America, in Nebraska, she's working on a sort of revisionist interpretation. I won't say anything more, but some very interesting work looking at the relationship really between George Henry Lewis and George Eliot. So yes, there are different ways of saying things and different angles to explore, as John said. Yeah.
And Beverly Rylett will be interesting because she and her team have managed to get funding, and we do an annual review, a George Eliot review, an academic thing really. In the early days, 50 years ago, it was more like a club magazine, but it's developed and it's now peer reviewed and it's an academic journal which is respected. And Beverly has set up a website to give access to all the back numbers, and it's getting huge numbers of because most of those early volumes have just disappeared. They went to members only, and so in the early days there wouldn't have been all that many of them. So that's been a huge effort and wonderful way of supporting George Eliot studies, actually, that Beverly's done. And she's now got another website on called George Eliot Archive, and she's trying to pull together all sorts of bits and pieces about George Eliot, all the portraits and anything that is George Eliot related, it'll be there.
That's
We're
wonderful.
trying to do a bit the same in our own new website. We're trying to mine our own archive of things, you know, of what the fellowship has done and various things that we've acquired. But
That's wonderful.
well, there are so many. Margarita Lasky, actually, it's 1973, I think it was published, so it's a bit old, but as a good introduction, without being a sort of 500-page blockbuster biography, Margarita Lasky's biography of George Eliot is excellent.
I did not know she wrote a biography of George Eliot.
Yeah. She was an interesting, I mean, I can remember seeing her on telly, but I'm a lot older than you are. But she's very good on George Eliot, and she managed to find pictures that hadn't been published before, and all sorts of interesting perspectives. So, and very readable. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Now, something I'm really looking forward to is Audible in November. I think it's maybe the 21st, but is releasing all of the George Eliot radio dramas together in a collection. And the only ones they haven't done as radio dramas are Romola and Felix Holt, but 5 radio dramas.
Wow.
So before you had to purchase them all separately, but they're putting them in a bind up. They've done this for the Bronte radio dramas and Jane Austen. So I'm really looking forward to that. And maybe that also, you know, now that I think about it, is another way that could maybe be a good gateway for people to read George Eliot, would be to approach it through radio drama.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. And because the 22nd of November is her birthday, so that might be why they released them at that time.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. So I know 2020 has been a very odd year for so many people. Do you know when the fellowship will be kind of resuming meeting in person, or do you have some virtual events going?
Well, both really. The only thing two things we've had this year. We had the annual general meeting about a week before lockdown.
Wow.
So at least we were able to make a few decisions then. And then we normally have a wreath laying. 2 wreath layings really. Alternate years we have a wreath laying in Westminster Abbey, which we did for the 200th last year. We do a lay wreath or several wreaths in Nuneaton. In Nuneaton there's an obelisk, a sort of memorial, which is in the George Eliot Memorial Gardens. It used to be at Arbury Hall, but after the war there were some buildings that were bombed, and that site was created as a George Eliot Memorial Garden. And incidentally, the Jewish community paid for some of the trees, which are still there. It's lovely because of their admiration for Daniel Deronda. So we couldn't have a full wreath laying. Normally, we go to town on it and we invite anybody with a sort of George Eliot reference in their name to come along and lay a wreath. So we get George Eliot Hospital, George Eliot School, and then Milby School, because there's a whole range of them. But we couldn't do that this year. But we did just get the person who was going to be our guest of honour, had it been a normal thing, to come along and lay 1 wreath. And she made a lovely little speech afterwards. And then also, actually, sort of at last minute, somebody laid a wreath in honour and in memory of our own members who had died. This was at the end of June, who had died either recently for other reasons or through the coronavirus pandemic. But there were only about 17 of us there, but at least it was an event, and there'll be pictures of it in the newsletter and so on. And then in October, we're going to have our first sort of virtual internet lecture. Gail Marshall's going to talk, and we're hoping as many people will hook up as possible to hear Gail Marshall, which will be really interesting.
And what will she be speaking on specifically?
She's speaking about, I can't remember the exact title, but she's interested in the way people relate, I think, I ought to have the title here, actually. She's interested in the way in which sort of fellowship and groups talk about and relate to George Eliot.
Oh, wow.
And I think she'll have interesting things to say, because she is a very interesting writer. And then we're hoping to have one of our members, wonderful a woman, Valerie Felnbaum in Geneva, is, all being well, coming over. And she has done a sort of one-woman show, really, Viv, isn't it? About Chrissy, George Eliot's older sister, who was the one who died in 1859. And so this is a sort of 40-minute presentation. And if things are relaxed enough for us to be able to do it, that will be...
yes, if I can interrupt there, yes, this probably won't be relevant when this goes out, but our Prime Minister has just decreed that only 6 of us can meet together. It's the power of 6 is everywhere at the moment. So he's locked us down further. So yes, we are wondering about what we can offer in the autumn. We'll see, things change weekly. So, but also the other event is our annual birthday lunch, which, as John alluded to, is always around November the 22nd, and this year it was the Sunday. It's always a Sunday around 22nd, and guess what? It is the 22nd. So we're going ahead with that in a local hotel, and hopefully that, fingers crossed, we will be gathered together. Our guest speaker is somebody. It was another highlight of 2019. Leslie Smith. Interesting woman, curator of Tutbury Castle in Shropshire, but she puts on the garb of George Eliot, and she entertains us, and is a monologue, I suppose, for an hour and a half, and she has had audiences in raptures. But it's not just George Eliot she does sort of Queen Elizabeth I or Boudicca or Margaret Thatcher,
really, isn't it, Viv?
a whole range. But I mean, she's good fun, and she was a bit of a highlight for our year last year.
It was.
So that's what we have 3 definite event, Gail's Zoom lecture or whatever, and the birthday lunch will happen on November the 22nd, and maybe this gathering with Valerie Felbaum. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's the best we can do. But thank you for setting this up, because this is wonderful. You see, we've got to get into the technology, and John actually has worked all the way through lockdown. He's working with our new website designer to put on a superb website, which is, I think, being launched by the time this goes out.
Next week or 10 days, hopefully it will go live.
Yeah. If you go live, everyone, you will see it linked in the description down below. So yes, fingers crossed.
Yeah. By the time this goes out, it should be up and running.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful.
There'll be bits to be added, of course, but that's websites, you can do that, can't you?
Yes, you can. Well, John and Vivienne, thank you so much. This has just been an utter delight to hear you wax eloquently about George Eliot, and hear about just the passion that is there in the Nuneaton area for George Eliot. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's been very interesting.
Yes.
So thank you, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.